He was a soldier once, brave, loyal, and strong. But when the war ended, the real battle began. Jake Miller came home with no family, no peace, and nowhere to go, until one freezing night, a broken wooden sign changed everything. The Haven, healing and trade school for veterans. He walked in a lost man and found a miracle waiting, a home not built from bricks, but from faith. A place where scars became stories and stories became hope. But when greed and darkness tried to destroy that hope, Jake and the people of the Haven had to fight again. Not with weapons, but with love, courage, and the hand of God. Stay with us until the end, because this story will remind you that miracles are still real. If this touches your heart, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps stories like this alive. And may God bless you for being here today. The wind that swept across northern Montana that afternoon carried the sting of frozen dust, biting at anything foolish enough to move against it. The sky was a single sheet of iron gray, low and heavy, pressing down on the endless stretch of prairie that reached toward the mountains. Along an empty two-lane highway walked a man in a frayed army jacket, his boots caked with mud and salt. That man was Jake Miller, 38, a veteran of Afghanistan who had once been known among his unit for his steadiness under fire. Now his steps were slow and uneven, as if each mile pressed memories deeper into the lines of his face. His short hair was streaked with gray despite his age. A faint scar ran from his left temple to the corner of his jaw. His eyes, steel blue, once sharp, had dulled into the watchful stillness of a man who no longer trusted the world to be kind. He had been drifting between towns, taking odd jobs, sleeping behind gas stations or in barns when the weather turned cruel. The war had ended years ago, but the sounds of it had never left him. Sometimes, even in daylight, he could hear the metallic echo of gunfire in the wind. The rain began as a thin mist, then thickened until the road shimmered like oil. Jake kept walking, one hand in his pocket, the other clutching the strap of his worn duffel bag. Cars passed him now and then. Farmers heading home, a bus full of high school kids returning from some distant tournament. But none slowed. He didn't blame them. A man with a soldier's posture and eyes that looked through you wasn't the kind of stranger people picked up in Montana backroads. After several miles, Jake spotted a sign half hidden behind a tangle of wild grass and fallen branches. The wood was warped and faded, the letters barely legible beneath a film of dirt. The Haven, healing and trade school for veterans. Beneath it, a smaller sign pointed up a gravel road disappearing into the trees. Jake hesitated. Places like that sounded too good to be true, too clean, too hopeful for the kind of broken men the world had forgotten. But the wind cut sharper now, and he had nowhere else to go. He turned up the gravel road. Each step crunched over loose stone and pine needles, and through the mist he began to see a collection of old cabins spread around a main lodge built from heavy timber. Smoke rose from a chimney, twisting through the rain. The place looked worn but alive. Patches of fresh lumber along the walls, stacks of firewood under tarps, and faint light spilling from windows. Jake's knock on the door echoed dully. For a moment, there was only the patter of rain. Then the door opened to reveal Kane Douglas. Kane was in his mid-50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with the quiet authority of someone who'd led men into danger and brought some of them back. His beard was thick, peppered with white, and his eyes, hazel with flecks of green, carried both kindness and exhaustion. The kind of eyes that had seen too much, but still chose to care. A faint limp marked his walk. The the souvenir of a leg wound from his years as a Marine. He wore a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, hands rough from carpentry rather than command. Standing beside him was Shadow, a German shepherd around 7 years old, large and disciplined, his coat a dark mix of sable and black. The dog's gaze followed Jake with quiet intelligence, tail still but ears alert. Kane studied Jake for a heartbeat before speaking. "You look like you've walked a long way." Jake nodded. "Long enough. Come on in before the weather freezes you." Inside, warmth wrapped around him, the smell of wood smoke, coffee, and something baking. The room was modest but cared for. Handmade furniture, maps pinned to the wall, and photographs of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder. A few people sat by the hearth, 2 men playing chess, a woman sweeping near the back. Kane handed Jake a towel. "We run a trade school here. Carpentry, mechanics, farming, depends on what you can handle. It's mostly vets. No one pays a dime. You work, you help around, you heal. That's the deal." Jake glanced around, uncertain. "You really do this for free?" Kane chuckled, the sound dry but genuine. "Nothing's free, son. We pay with time, sweat, and the will to try again. That's worth more than money." From the kitchen came a woman's voice. "Kane, you letting in strays again?" A tall woman appeared carrying a tray of mugs. This was Sarah Collins, mid-40s, lean and upright, her dark brown hair tied back beneath a faded scarf. The creases at her mouth hinted at years of forced smiles, but her eyes were bright and unafraid. Sarah had once been a military nurse. After losing her husband to suicide 3 years earlier, a fellow veteran, she joined Kane's project to keep others from falling the same way. Her manner was brisk but gentle, the sort that could bandage a wound and silence an argument in the same motion. She handed Jake a mug. "Drink. It's not fancy, but it'll thaw you out." Jake accepted the coffee, nodding thanks. Shadow came closer, sniffing once before settling beside the fire. Jake looked at the dog. "He doesn't bark much?" "Only when he needs to," Kane replied. "Wish I'd learned that trick." The warmth, the low laughter from the others, the sound of rain against the roof. All of it pressed strangely against Jake's chest. For the first time in years, he felt something other than emptiness. It wasn't comfort yet, but it was the memory of what comfort used to feel like. Later that evening, after a simple meal of stew and bread, Kane walked Jake around the property. The cabins were built by former students, each one different yet carrying the same rough craftsmanship. They passed a greenhouse, a small wood shop, and a barn where 2 men were repairing an old tractor. "Every hand that comes here builds something," Kane said. "That's how they heal. You don't talk about the past unless you want to. We work, we eat together, we keep the fire going. That's the rhythm." Jake nodded slowly. "And when someone leaves?" "They usually come back," Kane said. "Not everyone makes it, but those who do, well, they remember who pulled them through." They stopped near a wooden bench overlooking a frozen pond. Shadow sat at Kane's feet, his breath misting in the cold air. Kane's tone softened. "You look like a man carrying ghosts, Jake. You can leave them here if you want. The ground's heavy enough to hold them." Jake looked out over the pond, his reflection blurred by the wind. "I don't know if I remember who I was before." "Then you start with who you are now," Kane said. "That's enough." For a long moment, neither spoke. The sky cleared slightly, revealing a bruised purple horizon where the sun fought to break through. Jake realized the storm was easing. It wasn't much, but it was something. A pause, a breath, a space where life might start again. He turned to Kane. "You really think this place can fix people?" Kane smiled faintly. "Not fix. Help them remember they're still worth fixing." As night settled, the windows of the haven glowed against the dark trees like lanterns guiding lost travelers. Jake stood by the door before stepping inside, the warmth touching his face again. Shadow lifted his head, eyes calm, as if recognizing one more soul come in from the storm. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt he had somewhere to stay, not as a guest, but as a man beginning to heal. The morning sun over the Montana hills arrived pale and slow, casting long golden fingers through the mist that hung above the pine trees. The haven woke gradually, like an old beast stretching after a long sleep. Jake Miller rose early with the others, still unaccustomed to the rhythm of communal life. The air smelled of damp earth and sawdust. Somewhere near the greenhouse, hammers began to thud in steady rhythm. For the first time in years, he woke not to sirens or nightmares, but to the sound of people working together. After breakfast, Kane handed Jake a tool belt and led him to the roof of the old storage shed. "We'll start simple," Kane said. "Replace these shingles before the rain gets inside again." Jake's hands were stiff at first, his movements mechanical, but there was something calming about the repetition. The scrape of the hammer, the feel of wood under his palm, the quiet encouragement from below. Working nearby was Ben Torres, a stocky Latino man in his early 40s with a shaved head and a sleeve of faded military tattoos running down his right arm. Ben had served as a combat engineer before an explosion near Fallujah left his hearing partially damaged. He compensated with sharp observation and a dry sense of humor. "Keep that nail straight, soldier," he called up with a grin. "We don't need another crooked line in this house of broken men." Jake smirked for the first time in days. Ben was the kind of man who masked his pain behind jokes, yet there was gentleness in the way he guided others, especially the younger veterans who arrived lost and trembling. Inside the main lodge, Sarah Collins managed the kitchen and the infirmary, a balance of discipline and care. She moved with quiet precision, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back in a loose braid. Jake noticed that she rarely stopped moving. She seemed to believe that stillness invited memory, and memory was dangerous. Sometimes, when the others talked about their pasts, Sarah would drift to the window, her eyes far away, as if seeing someone who wasn't there anymore. By noon, the group gathered for lunch. Stew, bread, and coffee. Conversation hummed with small talk about weather, repairs, and crops. Across the table, Jake saw an older man sitting slightly apart from the others. He was thin, his skin leathery, eyes sharp despite the tremor in his hands. Kane introduced him as Earl Simmons, a Vietnam veteran who had been at the Haven since its founding. Earl's voice was gravelly, his laughter abrupt, but his stories carried weight, the kind that silenced a room. "We didn't have places like this back then," Earl said, staring into his cup. "You came home, you drank, you shut up. Guess you kids are lucky to have a place to bleed in peace." No one corrected him. In that silence, Jake felt both shame and gratitude. Days passed into weeks. Jake's body grew stronger. His hands found skill again in the act of building. He repaired fences, helped Ben craft new furniture for the lodge, and occasionally joined Sarah in delivering supplies to nearby farms. On one of those drives, he asked her why she'd stayed here so long. She kept her eyes on the dirt road ahead. "Because it's the only place where pain isn't treated like a disease," she said. "It's just part of being alive." Every evening, they gathered by the fire. Kane would read letters from veterans who had once lived there, men now working as carpenters, mechanics, or teachers across the state. They still sent donations, materials, or tools, small gestures that kept the haven alive. One night, as the flames flickered low, Kane spoke softly, his voice steady against the wind. "Healing isn't about forgetting the war," he said, echoing words that would root themselves deep in Jake's mind. "It's about learning to live with what it taught you, without letting it own you." But peace, as Jake learned, was fragile. One cold morning, a black SUV rolled up the gravel road, its tires crunching over frost. A man in a tailored coat stepped out, carrying a briefcase. His name was Philip Crane, the regional representative of Redwood Development. A tall, lean man in his mid-40s with slicked-back blonde hair and a smile that didn't reach his pale gray eyes. Everything about him radiated controlled confidence. Polished shoes, expensive cologne, and the tone of someone used to hearing the word yes. Kane greeted him on the porch, Shadow standing alert by his side. "You're trespassing on private property," Kane said evenly. Crane smiled thinly. "Just a visit. Redwood has plans for this area. A new residential community. Upscale but sustainable. The company's prepared to offer a generous purchase price. I believe it could help you expand elsewhere. Maybe a proper facility?" Jake watched from the workshop doorway, his jaw tightening. Kane crossed his arms. "This is the proper facility. People here don't need marble floors or glass walls. They need peace." Crane's expression hardened a fraction. "Peace doesn't pay the bills, Mr. Douglas. You're sitting on valuable land. Redwood's patience has limits." Shadow growled low, the sound deep and warning. Crane stepped back slightly, regaining his polished composure. "Think it over," he said, turning to leave. "Progress doesn't wait forever." After the SUV disappeared down the road, Ben muttered, "That guy's the kind who'd sell a church for parking space." Kane said nothing for a long while. Then he turned to Jake. "You see, healing doesn't mean we stop fighting. It means we choose what's worth fighting for." That night, the mood in the lodge was tense. Some of the newer residents whispered fears about eviction or losing the only home they'd known. Jake found Sarah near the fire, cleaning dishes in silence. "You think they'll come back?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "They always do. People like him don't understand what this place means. They only see dirt and numbers." Jake stared into the flames. "Then maybe it's time someone reminded them this dirt belongs to the living." The firelight caught the edges of Sarah's face, soft but resolute. "You sound like Kane," she said. "That's not a bad thing." Outside, the night grew colder. A storm brewed in the distance, thunder crawling along the horizon like the memory of artillery. Jake lay awake in his small cabin, listening to the wind rattle the windows. For the first time, his sleeplessness didn't come from fear, but from a rising sense of purpose. Somewhere deep inside, a soldier who had tried to die in silence was beginning to stir again. The haven slept, unaware of the battles that would soon reach its door. But within that fragile stillness, Jake Miller finally felt he belonged to something worth protecting. Winter crept early into the Montana Valley that year. The first snow came before Thanksgiving, covering the haven's rooftops in a thin white crust that cracked beneath each bootstep. The cold carried a silence that made every creak and gust of wind sound like a warning. Jake Miller stood at the edge of the property that morning, watching the forest sway under the weight of frost. The calm felt deceptive, too still, too fragile after the visit from Redwood's envoy. Within days, the strange incidents began. The power lines that fed the lodge were cut during the night. Tools vanished from the workshop. One morning, the barn doors were found broken, tire tracks leading away into the woods. Kane called the sheriff, but out here in the country, law enforcement moved slower than rumor. Sheriff's Deputy Colt Harrison, a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with a sunburned face and an unshaven jaw, came by to take a look. He was polite but detached, the kind of officer who had learned not to get too involved in local disputes. His brown eyes shifted often, avoiding confrontation. "Could be kids," he said, scribbling half-hearted notes. "We'll patrol when we can." Then he left, leaving behind more uncertainty than comfort. Kane refused to show fear. "We fix what's broken and keep going," he told everyone at breakfast. "They want to scare us off. We don't scare easy." But beneath his calm voice, fatigue had begun to show. His limp was worse in the cold. Sometimes he'd pause mid-sentence, rubbing his knee, then pretend it didn't hurt. Jake volunteered to install security cameras along the fences and rooftops. Working beside him was Lena Brooks, a new arrival, 30 years old, thin but wiry, with close-cropped red hair and freckles scattered across her pale face. She wore a mechanic's jacket, her hands perpetually smudged with grease. Lena had served as an Army vehicle technician before being medically discharged after an IED blast took 2 friends and left her with a shoulder full of shrapnel scars. She didn't talk much. When she did, her words were short and practical, as if emotion were a luxury she no longer afforded herself. "You think these cameras will help?" she asked while tightening a bolt on the metal pole. Jake nodded. "They won't stop anyone, but they'll show us who's coming." She smirked faintly. "Same thing I told Command back in Kandahar." Despite her dryness, Lena worked fast and clean, her movements efficient. In the evenings, she'd sit near the fire sharpening tools or sketching car parts in a notebook, muttering to herself. She reminded Jake of soldiers who survived not by faith, but by pure stubbornness. That night, the storm came. Wind howled against the cabins, and snow whipped sideways across the valley. Around midnight, the lights flickered, then went dark entirely. Jake, who had been lying awake, heard something outside, metal scraping, then footsteps. He grabbed a flashlight and slipped out, the beam cutting through the white blur. Near the workshop, he saw 2 figures in heavy coats moving quickly toward the back fence. "Hey!" he shouted. One of them threw a rock that shattered a window. Then both disappeared into the woods. Jake chased halfway before Kane's voice called him back. By morning, the damage was clear. The generator was sabotaged, cables torn out. Ben and Earl worked to repair it while Sarah distributed blankets and kept everyone calm. She moved like a commander under fire, her calmness infectious. "We've survived worse," she said. "Don't give them what they want." Later that day, Kane called a meeting. The entire community, about a dozen veterans and volunteers, gathered in the main hall. Outside, Shadow paced by the windows, ears twitching. "They're testing us," Kane said. "They think we'll fold if they push hard enough, but we're not giving up." Earl grunted. "In '69, they sent riot police after us for less. Let them come." His voice trembled, but his eyes burned. Jake looked around the room. "Then we get organized. We watch shifts. We keep records. We make sure if they hit us again, we hit back, with proof." Kane nodded slowly. "All right. Jake, you take charge of security. Ben and Lena reinforce the workshop doors. Sarah, coordinate with our donors for backup supplies. If they want to break us, they'll have to earn it. That night, the haven felt different. No longer a refuge, but a fortress in spirit. Jake patrolled with a flashlight and a borrowed rifle, though he never chambered a round. He didn't need to fight. He just needed to hold the line. The cold bit into his face, but his mind was steady in a way it hadn't been for years. He remembered Afghanistan, how chaos had been constant, but clarity always came in the middle of it. Here, in this quiet valley, he felt that clarity again. A few days later, a small victory came. One of the cameras caught footage of two men in construction uniforms tampering with the fence, faces partially visible. Jake transferred the clip to a laptop and showed it to Kane and Sarah. "That's enough to prove it's no prank," Sarah said. "We can take this to the sheriff." But before they could, Deputy Harrison returned uninvited, claiming he'd received reports of disturbance. His gaze lingered on the camera gear. "You folks running surveillance now?" he asked casually, though his tone carried suspicion. Kane met his stare. "We're protecting what's ours." The deputy sighed, tucking his notepad away. "Be careful, Mr. Douglas. Sometimes protecting what's yours can look like provocation." His words hung in the air like smoke. When he left, Sarah muttered, "They've got someone on the inside." That evening, Kane sat alone by the fire. Jake joined him quietly. "You ever think about walking away?" Jake asked. Kane smiled, lines deepening around his eyes. "Every day. But then I remember, if I walk away, who stays for the next broken soul that knocks on that door?" The question settled in Jake's chest like an anchor. He looked toward the window where snow fell thick and soundless. "Then I guess we don't walk away," he said. Outside, the wind howled again, carrying the faint rumble of a truck engine somewhere beyond the tree line. The shadows had returned, but so had something else. The iron bond of men and women who refused to lose another home to fear. The fire came just past midnight. It began as a flicker on the horizon, a thin orange shimmer through the line of snow-draped pines. By the time Jake Miller smelled smoke, the glow had already stretched into the sky. He was on patrol, walking the southern fence line, when the wind shifted and carried with it the unmistakable crack of burning timber. His pulse sharpened. "Fire!" he shouted, sprinting toward the workshop. By the time he reached the main yard, the old barn was half engulfed in flames. Sparks leapt into the black sky like furious stars, and the air stung with the acrid bite of diesel and ash. Kane was already there, limping through the snow, shouting orders. His flannel shirt was soaked through. His beard glistened with melting frost. "Buckets! Pumps! Keep it from spreading!" Ben Torres appeared with a hose line, his breath clouding like smoke as he fought to unwind it. Lena Brooks kicked open the side door of the equipment shed, pulling out shovels and axes. Sarah Collins ran from the main lodge with blankets and first aid supplies, her face pale but her voice steady as she directed the younger residents. "Stay low. Don't breathe the thick smoke." Jake grabbed a hose, aiming at the flames roaring from the barn windows. The heat was immense, nearly unbearable, but the veterans moved like soldiers again. Unspoken coordination, no panic, only purpose. Earl Simmons, the old Vietnam vet, drove the tractor forward to block the fire from spreading to the stables, his wrinkled hands steady despite the chaos. Shadow barked furiously near the fence, the deep German shepherd growl echoing across the yard. That was when Jake saw them, two silhouettes at the edge of the woods, faces hidden under ski masks. One held a canister, the other a flashlight. The beam briefly caught Jake's face before they vanished into the darkness. "Lena," Jake shouted, pointing. "The cameras!" She was already running toward the control shed. Within minutes, the external security feed was live on her laptop. The footage showed everything. The masked men sneaking through the tree line, pouring accelerant, striking a flare. Lena's jaw tightened. "Got him," she whispered, eyes glinting in the glow of the screen. By dawn, the fire was out, but the barn was gone. Half the equipment had burned to twisted metal. Kane sat on the frozen ground, staring at the wreckage. His hands trembled not from cold, but from fury contained too long. Sarah knelt beside him, touching his shoulder gently. "You saved the main lodge. That's what matters," she said softly. Kane exhaled hard, smoke and exhaustion mixing. "They want us gone," he murmured. "Now they'll know we're not going anywhere." The next morning, Jake and Lena drove into town with the camera footage. The local sheriff's office was small, an old red brick building with faded flags and a lobby that smelled of stale coffee. Deputy Colt Harrison was there, leaning back, in his chair, boots up on the desk. He looked up slowly as Jake entered, recognition flickering in his eyes. "You again." Jake placed the USB drive on the desk. "Proof. Your kids weren't kids. Redwood's people set the fire." Harrison sighed, sitting upright. His voice carried the measured caution of someone caught between orders and conscience. "That's a serious accusation. You sure you want to make enemies you can't afford?" Kane's voice came from behind Jake. "The only enemy here is the one hiding behind your badge." His tone was low but sharp. Harrison's jaw tensed, yet he said nothing. Jake could see it then, the fear, not of them but of the company. Redwood's reach ran deep. By afternoon, word spread faster than any official report. A young local journalist, Megan Price, arrived at the Haven with a small camera crew. She was 27, petite, with shoulder-length auburn hair tucked beneath a knit beanie. Her gray eyes carried the alert focus of someone who noticed everything. She had grown up in the nearby town of Pine Ridge, known for covering environmental protests and human interest stories that most big outlets ignored. Megan introduced herself to Kane with professional politeness, but there was warmth beneath it. "Mr. Douglas, I heard about the fire. Some folks are saying it wasn't an accident." "It wasn't," Kane said simply. "We've got the footage. You'll see for yourself." Megan spent hours interviewing residents, Ben fixing a pump, Sarah preparing meals for everyone, Lena quietly hammering new boards to cover the broken windows. Jake spoke last, his voice quiet but firm. "We came here to heal, not to fight. But if fighting is what it takes to keep this place alive, we'll do it the right way, with truth." That night, Megan's article went live under the headline, "Veterans Refuge Under Attack. Montana Healing Center, Targeted by Developers." The story caught fire online. Within days, donations poured in. Lumber, food, fuel, cash. Local volunteers drove up to help rebuild the barn. A nearby church organized a fundraiser. A carpenters' union offered free labor. When the first trucks arrived, Jake stood watching in disbelief as townsfolk carried planks and tools through the snow. Among them was an old woman with silver hair wrapped in a scarf. She introduced herself as Mrs. Donnelly, a retired teacher from Pine Ridge. "My husband was a vet," she told Jake, voice trembling but proud. "He didn't make it home whole. If places like this had existed back then, maybe things would have been different." Jake thanked her quietly, feeling a knot form in his throat. The Haven buzzed with life again. Hammering, sawing, laughter. Even Shadow seemed lighter, trotting around the workers, tail wagging. Kane gathered everyone that evening. The main hall was lit by candles and the faint glow of rebuilt power lines. He stood before them, his flannel, sleeves rolled up, eyes wet but burning with conviction. "They tried to break us," he said. "Instead, they showed the world who we are. This place isn't just wood and nails. It's every soul who refuses to give up. We'll rebuild stronger than before." Jake looked around at the faces glowing in the firelight. Ben cracking a rare smile, Lena leaning silently against the wall, Sarah's eyes glistening with pride, even old Earl nodding in approval. He realized then that the Haven had stopped being just a shelter. It had become a symbol. Outside, snow continued to fall, soft and pure, covering the ashes of the barn like forgiveness. The flames that had once threatened to destroy them had, in the end, lit the path forward. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and paper, an odd blend of history and bureaucracy. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, cutting sharp lines across the faces of those gathered. Kane Douglas sat at the defendant's table, his broad shoulders straight, but his hands resting calmly on the surface. The deep lines around his eyes looked carved by both war and time, yet today they held something unbroken. Beside him sat Jake Miller, wearing a dark jacket that didn't quite fit, his posture more soldier than civilian. Around them sat Sarah Collins, Ben Torres, Lena Brooks, and Earl Simmons, all dressed modestly, but carrying themselves with the quiet pride of people who had already survived worse battles. At the far end of the courtroom, Philip Crane, Redwood's polished representative, adjusted his tie. His once confident smirk had been replaced by the tight-lipped composure of a man whose empire was beginning to crack. The evidence was undeniable. The video footage, the testimonies from the residents, and even Megan Price's publicized investigation. Redwood's hired men had confessed when confronted with the recordings. The case had taken months to reach this point, but now it was nearing its end. The judge, Margaret Whitmore, a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair and a face both stern and compassionate, looked down from her bench. Her reputation was that of fairness. She was known across Montana for her refusal to bow to corporate pressure. Her clear blue eyes moved from the documents before her to the weary group at the table. This court recognizes that the Haven Veterans Center suffered deliberate sabotage and arson, orchestrated under the direction of Redwood Development, she said, her voice steady. The company is ordered to pay full restitution for damages, along with a formal public apology. Furthermore, this property will be designated as a protected veterans rehabilitation site under state law. There was a hush before the meaning of her words truly sank in. Then Sarah exhaled sharply, her hand flying to her mouth. Ben slapped the table, half laughing, half crying. Lena leaned back, eyes glistening but refusing to let tears fall. Kane turned slightly toward Jake, his voice low but thick with emotion. "We did it." Jake's reply came in a whisper, almost to himself. "You did it. You built something they couldn't tear down." Outside, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, townsfolk, and volunteers who had supported the Haven. Cameras flashed as the group emerged. Megan Price stood near the front, microphone in hand, smiling proudly, though she maintained her professional poise. She had followed the trial closely, writing articles that swayed public sentiment and exposed the greed behind Redwood's development plan. Her coverage had turned the Haven into a statewide symbol of resilience. "Mr. Douglas," she called, stepping forward, "what will you do now that the Haven has been officially recognized?" Kane paused, his breath visible in the crisp winter air. "We'll keep doing what we've always done, helping people find their way back. This victory isn't just for us. It's for every veteran who ever felt forgotten. Megan smiled. Do you think you've found peace? Kane looked at the faces beside him. Jake, Sarah, Ben, Lena, Earl, and then up toward the clear blue sky. Peace isn't a place, he said. It's people who refuse to give up on each other. The story spread across Montana and beyond. Donations increased, volunteers arrived from neighboring towns, and the haven began to grow in ways none of them had imagined. The following weeks were filled with rebuilding and renewal. The new barn rose quickly, larger and sturdier than before. A fresh coat of red paint gleamed against the snow. The workshop expanded to include a new carpentry wing, funded by contributions from local unions. Jake took charge of training the new arrivals, men and women still haunted by what they'd seen overseas. One of them, Tom Keegan, was a young veteran barely 26, lean and tall, his dark hair cropped close and his eyes distant, as if always searching for something behind the horizon. Tom had served in Syria and carried the quiet tremor of someone who had lost too much too soon. Jake saw himself in the boy, the same haunted gaze, the same uncertainty about where home truly was. On Tom's first day, Jake handed him a hammer and pointed to a half-built fence. "We build things here," he said. "That's how we fight back." Tom gave a tentative nod and set to work. By evening, his hands were blistered, but his expression had softened. That night, he joined the others by the fire, laughing at Ben's crude jokes, listening to Earl's endless stories about jungle humidity and bad rations. The walls of silence around him began to crack. Meanwhile, Sarah organized a counseling program with help from the state grant that followed their victory. She spent her days tending the wounded, both seen and unseen, and her evenings teaching mindfulness and breathwork to those who woke screaming in the night. Her warmth was steady as the hearth fire, yet her eyes often found Kane's across the table, two veterans of a different kind of war quietly holding the line together. Lena took over logistics, turning her mechanical precision toward managing supplies and repairs. She joked less now, but when she did, it carried genuine lightness. Ben became the resident instructor for welding and metalwork, teaching anyone willing to learn. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air again, not with destruction, but with renewal. As for Kane, he spent his mornings walking the perimeter with Shadow, whose muzzle had begun to gray, but whose loyalty never faltered. Sometimes Kane would stop near the pond, the one Jake had first seen when he arrived. The water was frozen now, clear as glass, beneath the morning sun. He would toss a stick across the surface, and Shadow, ever eager, would run after it before realizing it wouldn't sink. Then he'd look back, tail wagging, as if laughing at his own mistake. One evening, as the first true snow of the season began to fall, Jake stood on the porch, watching flakes drift silently through the pines. The horizon burned gold with the last light of day. Behind him, voices rose in laughter, new arrivals learning, rebuilding, belonging. The smell of soup drifted from the kitchen, and Sarah's soft humming filled the air. Shadow barked once in the distance, the sound echoing faintly through the woods. Kane stepped beside him, hands tucked into his coat pockets. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Jake said quietly, "I thought the war took everything from me, but it brought me here." Kane smiled, eyes soft under the dim light. "Then maybe that's what peace really is, finding the right place to stop running." They stood together as night settled over the haven, the windows glowing warm against the cold. Snow fell heavier now, cloaking the rebuilt roofs in white. For the first time in years, Jake didn't feel like a wanderer. The war was behind him, but what it left, purpose, brotherhood, hope, had finally found a home. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive as flashes of light or voices from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, in the shape of a stranger who lends a hand, a friend who refuses to give up, or a home that opens its doors when the world shuts you out. For Jake, Kane, and everyone at the Haven, that miracle wasn't about being rescued. It was about learning to see God's hand in the smallest acts of love, in the courage to keep standing, and in the faith that healing is always possible. Maybe you're carrying your own battle today. Maybe the scars are inside where no one can see. But remember this: God never leaves a wounded heart unattended. His grace works through people, through you, through me, through all of us, when we choose kindness over fear and compassion over judgment. So if this story touched you, if you believe in second chances, share it. Leave a comment to tell us your own story of hope. And don't forget to subscribe, because somewhere out there, another soul is still wandering through the storm, waiting to hear that they are not alone. May God bless you, and may His light guide you just as it guided them home.